The wagon wheels groaned against the rutted trail as Emily Grace Donahue pressed her handkerchief to her lips, tasting dust and disappointment. The journey from Kansas had taken 3 days of bone-jarring travel across prairie grass and rocky paths. 3 days of rehearsing what she would say to Charles Greeley when she arrived in Dry Hollow. Now, as the ramshackle buildings of the town came into view beneath the harsh afternoon sun, her carefully prepared words crumbled like drought-stricken soil. She had answered his advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper with trembling hands and foolish hope. Widower with young daughter seeks respectable woman for marriage. Must be willing to work hard and care for child. Board and modest living provided. The letter he'd sent in return had been brief, but seemed sincere enough. He needed help with his daughter. He'd written, the child's mother had passed 2 winters ago, and a girl needed a woman's guidance. Emily had packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small mirror, and the silver hairbrush that was her only inheritance and paid the last of her savings for passage west. At 32, with no family left and diminishing prospects in Kansas, she'd convinced herself this was God's plan. A chance for a new life, a family, a purpose beyond taking in other women's washing until her hands cracked and bled. The wagon driver, a grizzled man who'd spent most of the journey spitting tobacco juice over the side, pulled up near a weather-beaten building marked Greeley's General Goods. "This is it, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "Want me to wait while you fetch your man?" Emily's throat tightened. "No, thank you. I'm certain he's expecting me." She climbed down, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The wooden sidewalk creaked under her boots, practical ones. Not fashionable, but they'd served her well. She smoothed her brown traveling dress, tucked a strand of auburn hair back under her bonnet, and lifted her chin. Whatever Charles Greeley looked like, whatever kind of man he proved to be, she would make the best of it. She had to. The store's door stood open, letting out the mingled scents of pickle brine, leather, and coffee. Emily stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. Behind the counter stood a man of middle years, thin and sharp-featured, measuring out flour for a customer. A small girl, perhaps 7 or 8, sat on a barrel nearby, swinging her legs and humming tunelessly. "Mr. Greeley," Emily's voice came out steadier than she felt. The man looked up, and his expression shifted from distraction to confusion to something that made Emily's stomach drop like a stone down a well. His gaze traveled from her face, which she knew was pleasant enough, if planed down the considerable length of her body. She stood 5 feet and 10 inches in her stocking feet, taller still in boots. It was a height that had discouraged most suitors back in Kansas, but Charles Greeley's letter hadn't asked for her measurements. "You're Miss Donahue." His voice held disbelief and something sharper, displeasure. "I am." Emily held her carpetbag tighter, though it suddenly felt heavier than lead. "We corresponded about—" "I know what we corresponded about." He came around the counter, and Emily noted with sinking heart that she stood a good 3 inches taller than him. His daughter had stopped humming and now stared at Emily with wide, curious eyes. Charles Greeley studied her like a horse he was considering buying and finding lacking. "You didn't mention you were—" He gestured vaguely at her height. "This won't do at all. I beg your pardon." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You're too tall, too—" He shook his head. "What would people think a wife should be, should look? No, this arrangement won't work. I'm sorry you came all this way, but you're not what I expected." Not suitable at all. The words hit Emily like physical blows. She'd prepared for many possibilities that he might be cruel, or drink too much, or have exaggerated his circumstances. She hadn't prepared for outright rejection based on something she couldn't change or hide. "Mr. Greeley, if we could just—" "There's nothing to discuss." He was already retreating behind his counter, as if her height might be contagious. "I need a proper wife. Someone who'll fit in here. You're too peculiar, too different. Maddie, Stop staring at the lady." The little girl Maddie dropped her gaze, but not before Emily saw sympathy in those young eyes. It somehow made the humiliation worse. "Where am I to go?" Emily heard herself ask, though pride screamed at her to stay silent. "I spent everything to get here. I have no return fare." Charles Greeley's face hardened. "That's not my concern. I didn't ask you to be so unusual. There's a boarding house at the other end of town, though I doubt Mrs. Pritchard will have room. You might try the saloon. Sometimes they need help." "A saloon?" He was sending her to a saloon. Emily's hands shook as she gripped her bag, but she would not cry. Not here, not in front of this small, mean man and his daughter. "I see. Good day, Mr. Greeley." She turned with as much dignity as she could muster and walked out into the blazing sun. The wagon driver was long gone. Emily stood in the street, aware of curious faces peering from windows and doorways. Word would spread quickly the too-tall spinster from Kansas. Rejected before she even unpacked her bag. She needed water, needed to think, needed somewhere to collapse where no one could see. The saloon sat at the corner of Main and 2nd, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The painted sign reading "Red's Last Stand" hung at an angle. Emily had never entered such an establishment in her life, but her throat was parched and her options were none. She pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was dimmer than the general store, filled with the scents of sawdust, whiskey, and tobacco smoke, though only a few patrons occupied the tables at this hour. Behind the bar stood a woman with steel-gray hair and knowing eyes, polishing glasses with practiced efficiency. "Help you, miss?" The woman's voice held more curiosity than judgment. Might I have some water? Please, I can pay." The woman, who must be the wife of the Red who owned the place, studied her with those sharp eyes. "Just off the stage. You look done in. Sit yourself down." Emily sank onto a stool, her legs trembling with exhaustion and reaction. The woman filled a glass with cool water from a ceramic jug and slid it across the bar. "Thank you." Emily drank deeply, then noticed someone standing at the far end of the bar. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the rough clothes of a ranch hand. He held a beer but wasn't drinking, just watching her with dark eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat, unlike the curious stares she'd felt from others. His gaze held something else. Recognition, perhaps, though she was certain they'd never met. "You're the woman come to marry Charles Greeley," the bartender said. It wasn't a question. Emily's hand tightened on the glass. The arrangement has been dissolved." "On account of you being taller than him, I reckon." The woman's tone held dry amusement. "Charles always was particular about appearances. I'm Lorna. This is my place. Mine and my husband Red's." "Emily Donahue." She managed the introduction, though her throat felt thick. "I don't suppose you know of any employment opportunities or lodging. I find myself unexpectedly in need of both." Lorna glanced at the silent man at the end of the bar, some wordless communication passing between them. The man shifted slightly, the movement drawing Emily's attention to the quiet strength in his bearing, the weathered quality of his face that spoke of years under the sun. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a several days' growth of beard, but his clothes, while worn, were clean. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. "There's the old tack room out back of the stable," Lorna said slowly. "It's not much used to be where we stored supplies before we built the addition. It's got a cot and a stove. Roof doesn't leak. You could stay there for a bit while you figure things out." Emily knew charity when she heard it, but she was in no position to refuse. "That's kind of you. I can work to earn my keep. I'm good with a needle. Can cook, tend animals. We'll see." Lorna refilled Emily's water glass. "For now, you look like you need rest more than anything. Jace, you heading back to your place?" The man at the end of the bar, Jace, nodded once. "Mind showing Miss Donahue to the tack room? Maybe help her get that stove going?" Jace set down his untouched beer and moved with surprising quiet for such a large man. Up close, Emily could see his eyes were a deep brown, almost black, with lines at the corners that could have come from squinting into the sun or from some old sorrow. He didn't speak, just gestured toward the back door with one hand. Emily stood, gathering her carpet bag and what remained of her dignity. "Thank you," she said to Lorna, then followed the silent man out into the fading afternoon. They walked around the building to a small stable that had seen better days. Beyond it sat a structure that could barely be called a room, more like a large shed with a door and single window. Jace pushed open the door, revealing a space perhaps 8 feet by 10, containing a narrow cot, a pot-bellied stove, a single chair, and shelves that had once held horse liniments and leather goods. It was, Emily thought with a mixture of despair and bitter humor, still better than some places she'd slept while caring for her dying mother. Jace moved past her to check the stove, opening the damper and peering inside, apparently satisfied. He straightened and looked at her directly for the first time. The intensity of his gaze made her want to smooth her hair or straighten her dress, though she did neither. "There's wood out back," he said. His voice was low, rougher than expected, as if he didn't use it often. "Pumps by the stable for water." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You're not the first one he's turned away." Before Emily could ask what he meant, he was gone, walking back toward the saloon with that same quiet stride. She stood in the doorway of what was now her home, watching his broad back disappear around the corner of the building. The tears came then, hot and bitter. She closed the door, sank onto the cot which creaked alarmingly but held and let them fall. All her plans, all her hopes of a family and belonging, rejected because she'd had the audacity to grow too tall for a small man's pride. Outside, though she didn't know it, Jace Callahan stood in the shadow of the stable, hat in his hands, listening to the quiet sounds of a woman's grief. He stood there long after the sun set and her lamp went dark, keeping watch as he'd once kept watch over other things he couldn't save. Only when the night grew cold and her crying stopped did he finally walk away, his footsteps silent on the dusty ground. Emily woke to the sound of rain pattering on the tin roof. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching for the familiar quilt that had covered her bed in Kansas. Instead, her fingers found rough wool, and the reality of her situation crashed back. The tack room, dry hollow, Charles Greeley's disgusted face. She sat up, wincing at the protests from her back after a night on the thin mattress. Gray light filtered through the single window, revealing the Spartan nature of her new home in unforgiving detail. The pot-bellied stove sat cold and dark. She'd been too exhausted and heartsick to attempt lighting it the night before. A soft knock at the door made her start. Emily finger-combed her hair as best she could and opened the door to find Lorna standing in the drizzle, a covered basket in her hands. "Figured you might be hungry," the older woman said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "And it looks like you need a lesson in working that stove." "I can manage," Emily began, but Lorna was already kneeling by the stove, showing her where to find the kindling, how to adjust the damper. "No shame in not knowing," Lorna said. "Different stoves have different temperaments. This one's particular needs coaxing." Soon she had a small fire going, warmth beginning to creep into the cold room. "Red wanted me to tell you there's work if you want it. Nothing fancy helping me with cooking for the lunch crowd. Mending, cleaning, $1 a day plus meals." It was less than Emily had made taking in washing, but it included food. "I accept, and thank you. You've been very kind to a stranger." Lorna unpacked the basket biscuits, jam, a small pot of coffee. "You remind me of someone I knew once. Besides, Red and I have our reasons for helping folks who've been dealt a bad hand. You'll meet him later. He's gone to the mill this morning." They sat on the edge of the cot, sharing breakfast while rain drummed overhead. Lorna proved to be a fountain of information about Dry Hollow and its inhabitants. Charles Greeley came here 5 years back with his wife, bought the store from old Sam Winters. Wife was a pretty little thing, delicate as china. Took sick with lung fever their second winter. Lorna poured more coffee. He's been trying to replace her ever since, but he wants someone just like her, small, soft-spoken, decorative, posted advertisements in 3 states. I heard, Mr. Callahan said I wasn't the first to be turned away. Something shifted in Lorna's expression. Jace said that? Did he? That's more words than he usually strings together for strangers. She studied Emily with those sharp eyes. There was a school teacher from Missouri last year, and a seamstress from Nebraska before that. The teacher had a limp from childhood illness. The seamstress had pockmarks from survived pox. Charles sent them both packing. How cruel. Emily wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup. That's one word for it. Lorna stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. Come on over when you're ready. I'll show you around the kitchen. And Emily, don't mind the stairs. Small town folk are curious as cats, but they'll get used to you. After Lorna left, Emily washed as best she could with water from the pump, dressed in her second dress, a faded blue calico, and pinned her hair into a severe bun. She couldn't do anything about her height, but she could at least look respectable. The rain had softened to a mist as she made her way to the saloon's back entrance. The kitchen was larger than expected, with a massive cook stove, scarred wooden counters, and shelves lined with mismatched dishes. Lorna was already at work, slicing salt pork with quick, efficient movements. Know your way around a kitchen? Yes, ma'am. I kept house for my mother and myself for years. Good. We serve a simple lunch stew or beans, cornbread, pie if I've had time to make it. The men aren't particular as long as it's hot and plentiful. She handed Emily an apron. You can start by peeling those potatoes. We'll need about 30 pounds for today's stew. Emily set to work, falling into the familiar rhythm of kitchen tasks. Through the serving window, she could see the main room of the saloon beginning to fill with the lunch crowd ranch hands, mill workers, a few merchants. The atmosphere was livelier than the night before, filled with rough laughter and the clink of glasses. That's Red, Lorna said, pointing to a massive man with graying red hair who was drawing beers behind the bar. Fought in the war between the states, came west after. We met in Abilene and been together since. As Emily watched, Jace Callahan entered the saloon, hanging his wet hat on a peg by the door. Several men called out greetings, which he acknowledged with nods. He took his usual spot at the end of the bar, and Red slid him a beer without being asked. Jace runs cattle southeast of town, Lorna said, following Emily's gaze. Small operation, but he does all right, keeps to himself mostly. He was kind yesterday, Emily said, returning to her potatoes. He can be. He's got his reasons for understanding what it's like to have life pull the rug out from under you. Lorna's tone suggested this was all she'd say on the matter. The lunch rush was busier than Emily expected. She ladled stew, sliced cornbread, and tried not to notice the curious glances directed her way. Some men stared openly at her height. Others whispered behind their hands. She kept her eyes on her work, her movements steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. Hey, Lorna, one of the diners called out. Where'd you find the Amazon? Laughter rippled through the room. Emily's hand tightened on the ladle. Found her the same place I found my manners, Lorna shot back. Though appears you're still looking for yours. Tom Pritchard. More laughter, though directed at Tom this time. Emily glanced up to find Jace watching her from his seat at the bar. When their eyes met, he raised his beer slightly, a gesture so small she might have imagined it. But it felt like acknowledgement, like solidarity. The afternoon wore on. Emily's feet ached and her back protested from bending over the wash basin. But it was honest work, and Lorna was fair. When the last customer left, they sat at one of the tables, sharing leftover stew. You did good today, Lorna said, Tom Pritchard's an ass, but he's harmless. His wife runs the boarding house, probably why she had no room for you yesterday. She's particular about her guests. Emily had suspected as much. I'm grateful for the work. And the shelter. You planning to stay in Dry Hollow? It was a fair question. One Emily had been asking herself all day. I don't know. I have nowhere else to go at present. Red joined them, his large frame making the chair creak. Up close, Emily could see scars on his hands and a long one down his neck, partially hidden by his collar. Jace said to give you this, he said, sliding something across the table. It was a worn but serviceable oil lamp, better than the stub of candles she'd found in the tack room. That's kind of him, Emily said, puzzled by the gift. He noticed you didn't have proper light last night, Red said simply. Emily looked toward the bar, but Jace had left without her noticing. Please thank him for me. You can thank him yourself. He'll be back tomorrow. Red stood, beginning to stack chairs. Always is. That evening, Emily returned to the tack room to find more than just the lamp waiting for her. A bundle wrapped in brown paper sat by her door. Inside was a thick blanket, obviously old but clean and warm. No note, but she knew who had left it. The rain had returned, heavier now, drumming on the roof and making the walls shake. Emily lit her new lamp, pleased at how much brighter it made the small space. She tried to read her mother's Bible, but found her mind wandering. Why would Jace Callahan, a man who barely spoke, show such quiet kindness to a stranger? Lorna had hinted at some past sorrow, some understanding of hardship. Emily knew about carrying grief. She'd nursed her mother through 2 years of declining health, watching her fade away by degrees. But there was something else in Jace's eyes, something that went beyond mere sympathy. A flash of lightning illuminated the window, followed by a crack of thunder. The stove was working well now, keeping the worst of the chill at bay, but rain began to seep through a corner of the roof she hadn't noticed before. Emily positioned her wash basin to catch the drips and resigned herself to the rhythmic plink of water on metal. She was just preparing for bed when she noticed a shadow outside her window. Her heart jumped, but then she recognized the broad shoulders, the familiar stance. Jace stood in the rain, seemingly oblivious to the water streaming off his hat. He wasn't looking at her window, just standing there, positioned between the tack room and the rest of the world. Emily's first instinct was to open the door, to ask him what he was doing, to invite him out of the rain. But something held her back. There was purpose in his stance, in the way he'd positioned himself. He was standing guard. The realization brought tears to her eyes. This man who didn't know her, who had exchanged barely a dozen words with her, was standing in a thunderstorm to make sure she was safe on her second night in a strange place. Emily blew out the lamp and lay down, pulling the gifted blanket up to her chin. Outside, she could just make out Jace's silhouette when lightning flashed. He stayed there, unmoving, until her exhaustion finally pulled her under. In the morning, she woke to find the rain had stopped and Jace was gone, but pressed into the mud outside her door were boot prints, evidence of his night-long vigil. Beside the door sat another bundle, this one containing a small sack of coffee, a tin of biscuits, and fresh eggs wrapped in cloth. Emily gathered the gifts, her throat tight with emotion. She'd been rejected, humiliated, reduced to living in what amounted to a shed, but she'd also found unexpected kindness from people who owed her nothing. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how you started over one small kindness at a time, one day at a time, until you'd built something new from the ruins of your plans. She made coffee on her little stove, scrambled eggs in the pan Lorna had lent her, and prepared for another day of work. The townspeople would stare. Tom Pritchard would probably make more comments. Charles Greeley would continue to exist in his small, mean way. But Jace Callahan would come for his lunch and his beer. He would sit at the end of the bar and say little, but his presence would be steady and sure. And maybe tonight, if it rained again, she would look out to find him keeping watch. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she left Kansas, But as Emily stepped out into the morning sun, she thought perhaps it might become something better, something chosen rather than arranged, something built on truth rather than desperate convenience. Time would tell. A week passed, then 2. Emily fell into the rhythm of life at Red's last stand, her days measured in pounds of potatoes peeled, gallons of stew served, and the quiet kindnesses that appeared at her door. Every morning brought some small gift, a jar of preserves, a pair of thick socks, a bar of good soap. She never saw Jace leave them, but she knew. The townspeople's curiosity hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified as word spread that the tall woman from Kansas was staying, working at the saloon, living in the old tack room. Women clutched their shopping baskets tighter when she passed on the street. Men either stared openly or averted their eyes entirely. Children pointed until their mothers slapped their hands down. "Don't let them worry you," Lorna advised one afternoon as they prepared for the lunch rush. "Small minds need something to gossip about. Next month, it'll be something else." But Emily felt the weight of their scrutiny. She'd started taking the back routes when she needed supplies, shopped early when the streets were empty. The isolation was wearing on her in ways she hadn't expected. "Why don't you take Charles Greeley up on his offer?" Tom Pritchard asked one day, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Heard he's still looking for a wife. Maybe if you walked on your knees." The men around him guffawed. Emily's hands stilled on the plate she was clearing. Before she could respond, a chair scraped against the floor. Jace stood from his usual spot, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked to Tom's table and simply stood there, looking down at the smaller man. The laughter died. Tom's face reddened. "Just having some fun. Jace, no harm meant." Jace didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Finally, Tom threw some coins on the table and left, muttering under his breath. Jace returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. "Thank you," Emily said quietly when she brought him fresh coffee. He looked up at her then, those dark eyes holding something she couldn't quite read. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." It was the most he'd said to her since that first night. That evening, Emily decided to transform her living space. She couldn't change the town's opinion of her, but she could make the tack room less dismal. Using her needle and some flour sacks Lorna had given her, she began sewing curtains for the small window. A knock interrupted her work. She opened the door expecting Lorna, but found Jace holding a wooden crate. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting the box down. Inside were basic tools, a hammer, nails, sandpaper, a saw. "I don't understand," Emily said. "Why are you—" "You're not the first person to end up somewhere you didn't expect," he interrupted gently. "Difference is, you're making the best of it instead of running." "Where would I run to?" The question came out more bitter than intended. Jace's expression softened slightly. "That's the thing about running. Doesn't matter where you go if you're trying to escape yourself." He turned to leave, but Emily caught his sleeve. "Wait, would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." He hesitated, then nodded. Emily hurried to get another chair from the stable while he examined the leak in the corner of the roof. When she returned, he was already working, using scraps of wood to patch the hole. "You don't have to," she began. "Easier with 2 people," he said. "You can hand me the nails." They worked in comfortable silence, Jace fixing while Emily assisted. When the patch was complete, she poured coffee and they sat, the small space feeling less lonely with another person in it. "Lorna says you run cattle," Emily ventured. "Small herd, enough to get by." "Do you have help?" "When I need it. Prefer working alone most times." Emily understood that preference. "I used to think I wanted to be surrounded by people. A big family, lots of children, constant noise and activity. Now," she gestured at the quiet room, "this has its merits." "Solitude's honest," Jace agreed. "No pretending to be something you're not." They sipped their coffee, the silence stretching but not uncomfortably so. Finally. Jace set down his cup. You planning to stay in Dry Hollow? It was the same question Lorna had asked, but from Jace it felt different. Weightier. I don't know. I'm not sure I belong anywhere anymore. Belonging's overrated, he said. Better to find a place that lets you be who you are. After he left, Emily sat for a long time thinking about his words. She'd spent her whole life trying to fit in, hunching her shoulders to seem shorter, speaking softly to seem smaller, accepting whatever scraps of acceptance came her way. Maybe it was time to stop. The next morning, she stood straighter as she walked to work. When Tom Pritchard made another comment about her height, she looked him directly in the eye and said, "Yes, I'm tall. Your powers of observation are remarkable." Red nearly choked on his coffee, laughing. Days passed. Emily continued her improvements to the tack room, scrubbing years of grime from the shelves, patching cracks in the walls, even painting the door with some leftover paint Red found in storage. The space began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. One evening, as she was hemming the curtains, Jace appeared with something wrapped in burlap. "Found this in my barn," he said, unwrapping a small mirror in a wooden frame. "Thought you might want it." Emily's hand flew to her throat. She'd been without a proper mirror for weeks, making do with her reflection in windows and water basins. "It's lovely, but I can't keep taking gifts from you without giving something in return." "You already have," he said simply. "How?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "You reminded me that starting over doesn't mean giving up." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving only the mirror and more questions. Emily hung the mirror carefully on the wall. Her reflection surprised her. She looked different somehow. Not in any dramatic way, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A steadiness, a determination. She thought about Charles Greeley, probably sitting in his store right now, still searching for a woman who would fit his narrow definition of suitable. She thought about the women who'd come before her, sent away for their perceived flaws. And she thought about Jace, who asked for nothing but gave anyway, who understood rejection and loneliness but hadn't let it make him mean. That night, she made a decision. She would stay in Dry Hollow, at least for now. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she was beginning to build something here. It might not be the life she'd imagined, but it was real and honest and hers. The next day, she used some of her saved wages to buy fabric from the general store, ignoring Charles Greeley's disapproving stare. She would make herself a new dress, one that fit properly, that didn't try to disguise her height. If the town wanted to stare, let them stare at something worth seeing. When Jace came for his usual lunch, he noticed immediately. "You look different," he said. "Same height," Emily replied, just unapologizing for it. Something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Good." That evening, as she worked on her new dress, Emily heard the sound she'd been unconsciously listening for footsteps outside her door. She peered through the curtains to see Jace taking up his now familiar post, standing guard against the darkness and whatever it might bring. She wanted to tell him he didn't need to, that she felt safe now. But she understood it wasn't really about her safety. It was about his need to protect, to watch over something in a world where he'd clearly lost something precious. So she let him stand there, and when the night grew cold, she quietly opened the door and left a cup of hot coffee on the step. In the morning, the cup was empty, returned to its spot with a small wildflower laid beside it. Emily picked up the flower, inhaling its delicate scent. Change came slowly to places like Dry Hollow, to people like her and Jace. But it came, one small kindness at a time, one tiny courage building on another. She pressed the flower between the pages of her mother's Bible and prepared for another day. The townspeople would stare. Tom Pritchard would make his comments. But she would stand tall, all 5 feet 10 inches of her, and she would endure. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps, someday, She might do more than just endure. She might actually live. The spring fair came to Dry Hollow on a Saturday that dawned clear and bright. Emily had been in town for nearly 6 weeks now, and the prospect of the annual celebration filled her with equal parts anticipation and dread. Lorna had given her the day off, insisting she should enjoy the festivities. "You can't hide forever," Lorna had said, pressing a few extra coins into Emily's hand. "Besides, you've got that new dress to wear." The dress was indeed finished, a deep blue calico that fit her tall frame properly, with a modest bustle and sleeves that didn't pull at her shoulders. Emily had spent extra care on her appearance that morning, pinning her auburn hair into an elegant twist and pinching color into her cheeks. If she was going to face the entire town, she would do it with dignity. The main street had been transformed. Booths lined both sides, selling everything from preserves to leather goods. Children ran between the displays, their laughter mixing with fiddle music from the small platform erected near the church. The air smelled of baking pies and roasted corn. Emily moved through the crowd, trying to ignore the familiar stares and whispers. She stopped at a booth selling ribbons and lace, admiring the delicate handiwork. "Those would look pretty in your hair," a small voice said. Emily looked down to find Mattie Greeley, Charles's daughter, gazing up at her with curious eyes. The child wore a yellow dress with careful patches at the elbows. "Hello, Mattie," Emily said gently. "You look very pretty today." "Papa says I shouldn't talk to you," Mattie whispered, glancing around nervously. "But I think you're nice and tall like a princess in my storybook." Before Emily could respond, Charles Greeley appeared, his face flushed with anger. "Mattie, come away from there!" He grabbed his daughter's hand, pulling her back. "I told you to stay away from her." "But Papa, she's—" Not another word. He shot Emily a venomous look. "Some people don't know when they're not wanted." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I meant no harm. Mr. Greeley, your daughter approached me." "Well, she won't make that mistake again." He dragged Mattie away, the child looking back over her shoulder with apologetic eyes. The encounter left Emily shaken. She moved away from the crowds, finding a quiet spot near the church steps. The music and laughter seemed distant now, belonging to a world that had no place for her. She was contemplating returning to the tack room when she noticed a commotion near the dancing platform. A space had cleared in the crowd, and in the center stood Jace Callahan. He wore clean clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked uncomfortable but determined. Their eyes met across the square, without breaking her gaze. Jace walked through the crowd, people parting before him like water. He stopped in front of her and extended his hand. "Miss Donahue," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "would you honor me with a dance?" Emily's breath caught. Everyone was watching now, the entire town waiting to see what the tall spinster would do. She could see the challenge in some faces, the curiosity in others. "Mrs." Pritchard whispered furiously to her husband. Charles Greeley scowled from across the square. Emily's voice faltered. "I'm not much of a dancer, Mr. Callahan." "Neither am I," he said, his hand still extended. "Seems we're suited then." The fiddle player had started a slow waltz, the notes hanging in the air like a question. Emily looked at Jace's outstretched hand, weathered from work but steady. She thought of all the times she'd shrunk back, all the invitations she'd declined for fear of standing out. But then she remembered his words, "Better to find a place that lets you be who you are." She placed her hand in his. The crowd murmured as Jace led her to the platform. Emily was acutely aware of their height. She was only an inch or two shorter than him, even in her modest heels. But when he placed one hand on her waist and took her other hand in his, she found she didn't care. They moved awkwardly at first, both clearly out of practice, but gradually they found their rhythm, turning slowly while the town watched. Emily could feel the strength in Jace's arms, the careful way he guided her through the steps. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me as someone worth dancing with. His hand tightened slightly on her waist. I see you as more than that. The dance ended too soon. Jace bowed slightly. Emily curtsied, and then she fled. Not ran, exactly, but walked quickly away from the platform, away from the stares and whispers, away from the intensity in Jace's eyes that she didn't know how to interpret. She made it to the edge of the fairgrounds before the tears came. Angry at herself for crying, she wiped them away furiously, but they kept falling. All the rejection, all the loneliness, all the hope she'd tried to bury it all came rushing out. Emily! She turned to find Jace behind her. Having followed her retreat, he stood there, just out of reach, his hands at his sides. I'm sorry, she said. I don't know why This is foolish. No, he said quietly. It's not. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her. He just stood there, solid and patient, while she cried out weeks of suppressed emotion. When the tears finally slowed, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. I've made a spectacle of myself, Emily said, dabbing at her eyes. You stood up in front of people who've been unkind to you and danced with dignity. Jace countered. That's not a spectacle. That's courage. Emily looked at him, really looked at him. In the late afternoon light, she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, could see the way his jaw clenched as if he was holding back words. Why? She asked. Why have you been so kind to me? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Had a woman once, Sarah. We were engaged, planning a life together. The fever took her 3 winters back. He paused, his gaze distant. After she died, folks tried to be kind, but their kindness came with expectations that I'd grieve the right way, move on at the right pace, find someone new when they thought it was time. You're the first person who hasn't looked at me with pity or calculation. I'm sorry, Emily whispered. About Sarah. So am I, he said simply. But I'm not sorry you came to Dry Hollow. They stood there as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the sounds of the fair distant and dreamlike. Finally, Jace cleared his throat. Will you come back to the dancing? I mean, we don't have to dance again if you don't want, but you shouldn't let them chase you away from your own town celebration. My own town, Emily repeated softly. When had she started thinking of Dry Hollow that way? Yes, Jace said firmly. Your town, your home, your choice. Emily straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt. All right, but only if you promise to glare at anyone who says something cruel. A rare smile touched his lips. I can do that. They walked back together, Emily's hand resting lightly on Jace's offered arm. The crowd parted for them again, but this time Emily held her head high. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She'd danced at their fair, and she'd dance again if she chose to. Red raised his beer in salute as they passed. Lorna smiled knowingly from her booth selling pies. Even little Mattie Greeley waved shyly before her father noticed and pulled her away. As the evening progressed, Emily found herself enjoying the fair despite everything. She and Jace didn't dance again, but they walked together, looked at the displays, shared a piece of honey cake. When other men asked her to dance, and surprisingly, a few did, Jace stood back and let her make her own choices. She declined politely, not ready for that much exposure, but appreciated that the choice was hers. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit throughout the square, Jace walked her back to the tack room. Thank you, Emily said at her door. For the dance, for the company, for... She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate all he'd done. There's a barn dance next month, he said. Maybe by then you'll be ready to dance more than once. Maybe I will, she agreed. He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go, but Emily called him back. She handed him a small, wrapped package, something she'd bought at the fair on impulse. What is it? He asked. Open it, Inside was a new handkerchief, embroidered with his initials. "To replace the one you gave me," she explained. Jace studied the careful stitching, then tucked the handkerchief into his pocket. "I'll treasure it," he said simply. After he left, Emily sat on her cot, still in her new dress, reliving the afternoon. She'd been truly seen not as an oddity or a disappointment, but as a woman worth asking to dance, worth waiting for while she cried, worth defending against cruel words. Outside her window, she could hear the last sounds of the fair being packed away. Tomorrow, Dry Hollow would return to normal. Tom Pritchard would make his jokes. Charles Greeley would scowl. The women would whisper behind their hands. But something had shifted today. Emily had claimed her place in this town, had stood tall literally and figuratively, and survived. More than survived. For a few minutes on that platform, in Jace Callahan's arms, she'd felt like she belonged. She pulled out the small piece of paper Jace had left weeks ago, now soft from handling. "Lan sao an se hong dong yen nu em kok." Except he'd written it in English. "Next time, I won't stand still if you cry." Emily smiled, tracing the words with her finger. Next time. The promise of it warmed her more than the stove ever could. The week following the spring fair passed in a blur of ordinary days. But Emily felt the change in how some townspeople looked at her. Not all of them. Tom Pritchard still made his cutting remarks, and Charles Greeley crossed the street to avoid her, but others nodded when they passed, and a few women even offered tentative smiles. "You've crossed the bridge," Lorna observed one morning as they prepared for the lunch crowd. Dancing with Jace Callahan in front of the whole town that took sand. Emily needed biscuit dough, her movements practiced and sure. He asked. It would have been rude to refuse. Lorna snorted. "Honey, you could have refused and everyone would have understood. You chose not to. That's different." The truth of it sat warm in Emily's chest. She had chosen, despite the fear, despite the certainty of judgment, and the sky hadn't fallen. That afternoon, Lorna asked Emily to deliver fabric to Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the hill country outside town. "Her rheumatism's acting up," Lorna explained. "Can't make the trip down. Thought you might enjoy the ride. Spring's pretty in the high country." Emily accepted gratefully. She'd been in Dry Hollow for 2 months, but had seen little beyond the main street. Lorna arranged for her to use the saloon's old wagon, warning her about the tricky spots on the trail. The day was glorious, with wildflowers blooming along the roadside and meadowlarks calling from fence posts. Emily guided the horse carefully, enjoying the solitude and the vast sky. The Henderson place sat 5 miles out, a neat frame house with chickens scratching in the yard. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a cheerful woman of 60, delighted to have company. She insisted Emily stay for tea, chattering about her grandchildren and the challenges of keeping house so far from town. When Emily mentioned she was boarding at the saloon, Mrs. Henderson's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're the tall girl from Kansas. Heard about the dancing." She poured more tea. "Also heard Jace Callahan's been looking after you some?" Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's been kind." "That's one way to put it." Mrs. Henderson studied her shrewdly. "That boy hasn't shown interest in anyone since his Sarah passed. You must be something special." "We're friends," Emily said carefully. "Nothing more." "Mm-hmm." The older woman's tone suggested she wasn't fooled. "Well, you be careful on the way back. That creek crossing can be tricky when the snow's melting upstream." Emily should have heeded the warning more carefully. The trip to the Henderson place had been smooth, but by the time she started back, clouds had gathered over the mountains. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind whipped across the prairie. She reached the creek crossing just as the first raindrops fell. What had been a shallow stream that morning was now running faster, fed by snowmelt and the approaching storm. Emily studied the ford uncertainly. The water didn't look deep, but it was moving with surprising force. The horse balked at the edge. tossing its head nervously. Emily urged it forward, and reluctantly the animal stepped into the stream. They were halfway across when the wagon wheel caught on a submerged rock. The jolt threw Emily from her seat. She grabbed for the wagon side but missed, tumbling into the icy water. The current wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet, but it was swift and shocking cold. Her skirts tangled around her legs as she struggled to find footing on the slippery stones. The horse, freed from her guidance, lunged forward, dragging the wagon up the far bank and stopping in the grass, leaving Emily floundering in the middle of the stream. She managed to grab a boulder, clinging to it as the water tugged at her clothes. "Help!" The word came out as barely a whisper, her breath stolen by the cold. She tried again, louder. "Someone help!" But she was miles from town, with no houses in sight. The rain was falling harder now, and Emily realized with growing panic that she couldn't feel her feet. Her grip on the rock was weakening, her fingers numb. Just when despair threatened to overwhelm her, she heard hoofbeats. Through the rain, she saw a rider approaching at full gallop, even at a distance. She recognized Jace's broad shoulders and the way he sat his horse. He didn't hesitate at the creek's edge, spurring his mount directly into the water. In seconds, he was beside her, swinging down from the saddle with practiced ease despite the current tugging at his boots. "Emily!" His arms went around her, lifting her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. "Are you hurt?" She tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard. Jace carried her to the bank, his strength evident in how easily he navigated the treacherous footing. Once on solid ground, he set her on her feet, but her legs buckled immediately. Can't stand," she managed through chattering teeth. Without a word, Jace swept her up again. He carried her to where his horse waited, then somehow managed to mount while still holding her. Emily had no choice but to press against his chest, his warmth a stark contrast to her sodden clothes. "The wagon," she tried to protest. "Leave it! Hold on to me!" She wrapped her arms around his waist as he urged the horse forward. The ride back to town passed in a blur of cold and motion. Emily was vaguely aware of people staring as they entered Dry Hollow, of voices calling questions, but Jace ignored them all. He didn't stop at the saloon but continued to the tack room. Lorna appeared as if by magic, taking in the situation with one glance. "Get her inside," she ordered. "I'll bring dry clothes and hot water." Jace carried Emily through the door, setting her gently on the cot. Her teeth still chattered uncontrollably, and she couldn't stop shaking. "Your feet," he said, kneeling before her. "We need to check for frostbite." Under normal circumstances, Emily would have protested a man removing her boots, but these weren't normal circumstances. Jace's hands were gentle but efficient as he unlaced her boots and peeled off her sodden stockings. "Can you feel this?" He pressed carefully on her toes. "Yes." The pins and needles sensation was painful but reassuring. "Good, that's good." Relief colored his voice. Lorna bustled in with an armload of supplies, blankets, towels, dry clothes, and a kettle of hot water. She took one look at Jace's position and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I'll help her change." Lorna said pointedly, "You go get Red. Tell him to bring the whiskey, the good stuff, not what we serve the customers." Jace rose reluctantly. His clothes were soaked through from carrying Emily, his dark hair plastered to his head. "I'll be right back," he promised. After he left, Lorna helped Emily out of her wet things and into dry clothes, tisking over the scraped on her palms and the bruise forming on her hip where she'd hit the wagon. "What were you thinking? Trying to cross during snowmelt?" Lorna scolded gently as she toweled Emily's hair. "It didn't look that deep," Emily said, her voice small. "How did Jace know I was in trouble?" "He was headed out to check his cattle and saw the wagon leave town. When the storm rolled in, he got worried." Lorna wrapped a blanket around Emily's shoulders. "Good thing, too, that creek's killed more than one person who underestimated it." Red arrived with the whiskey and a concerned expression. He poured a generous measure into a cup and pressed it into Emily's hands. "Drink, it'll warm you from the inside." The liquor burned, but it did help stop the shaking. Jace returned, having changed into dry clothes from somewhere. He took the chair beside the cot, his dark eyes never leaving Emily's face. "I'm all right," she assured him. "Thanks to you. You could have drowned." His voice was rough with some emotion she couldn't identify. "When I saw you in that water—" He stopped, jaw clenching, without thinking. Emily reached out and took his hand. It was warm and calloused and trembled slightly in her grip. "But I didn't drown. You came." "I'll always come," he said quietly, so only she could hear. The weight of that promise settled between them. Emily became aware that Red and Lorna had discreetly disappeared, leaving them alone. The rain drummed on the roof, but inside the small room, there was only warmth and the space between their clasped hands. "Why were you really out there?" Emily asked. "Your ranch is in the other direction." Jace was quiet for a long moment. "Lorna mentioned she was sending you to the Hendersons. When I saw the storm building," he shrugged. "Had a feeling." "You followed me." "I watched out for you," he corrected. "There's a difference." Emily thought about all the times she'd found him outside her door at night, all the small gifts left in the morning, all the quiet protections she'd only half noticed. "Jace," she began, but he shook his head. "You need rest. We can talk when you're warm and dry and not shaking like a leaf." But Emily gripped his hand tighter when he tried to pull away. "Stay, please, just for a while." He settled back in the chair. "All right." They sat in silence, hands linked, listening to the rain. Emily felt drowsiness creeping in the warmth, the whiskey, the emotional exhaustion all combining to pull her under. But just before she drifted off, she heard Jace speak, so softly she might have imagined it. "Thought I'd lost you today. Can't go through that again. Can't lose someone else, He stopped, but Emily's heart filled in the word he hadn't said. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of what couldn't yet be spoken. Then sleep claimed her, and she knew nothing more until morning, when she woke to find Jace still there, still holding her hand, still keeping watch as he always did. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, and something between them had shifted, like creek stones rearranging themselves after a flood. Neither of them spoke of it, but it was there in the way their eyes met, in the careful tenderness of his touch as he helped her test her weight on her feet, in the way her hand sought his without thinking. They had crossed their own dangerous water and made it to the other side. What came next remained unspoken, but Emily felt it building like another storm on the horizon, not threatening this time, but promising something that might, if they were brave enough, wash them both clean. The days following the creek incident brought unwanted attention. Word spread quickly through Dry Hollow about how Jace Callahan had rescued the tall woman from Kansas, how he'd carried her through town in his arms, how he'd stayed by her side through the night. The gossip mill churned with renewed vigor. "Heard she staged the whole thing." "Mrs." Pritchard whispered loudly enough for Emily to hear as she passed the mercantile. "Trying to trap him into marriage, mark my words." Emily kept walking, her chin high, but the words stung. She'd been back at work for 3 days now, her bruises fading to yellow-green, the scrapes on her palms nearly healed. Jace had been noticeably absent from his usual lunch visits, and she tried not to read too much into it. "Don't let the biddies get to you," Lorna advised as they cleaned up after the lunch rush. "They've got nothing better to do than flap their gums." But it wasn't just the women. The men had their own opinions, voiced freely in the saloon when they thought Emily couldn't hear. "Callahan's gone soft," Tom Pritchard declared over his beer. "First is Sarah, now this one. Man needs to learn to let go of lost causes." "That's enough, Tom." Red's voice carried a warning. "Man saves a woman from drowning. That's called being decent." "Is that what we're calling it now?" Tom's laugh was ugly. "Way I heard it, she threw herself in that creek on purpose. Desperate women do desperate things. Emily's hands shook as she dried glasses in the kitchen. She hadn't realized how cruel the speculation had become, how twisted the story. Worse, she worried about what Jace was hearing, what he might be thinking. That evening, she was sweeping the saloon's back step when she heard horses approaching. Not one or two, but several. She looked up to see 5 men dismounting, Jace among them. They all wore the weathered look of cowboys who'd been working cattle, dust-covered and weary. "Boys are thirsty," one of them called to Red. "Long day moving the herd down from winter pasture." They filed into the saloon, spurs jangling. Jace paused at the door, his eyes finding Emily across the room. He touched his hat brim in greeting but didn't approach, taking his usual seat at the bar with his men. Emily tried to focus on her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence. He looked tired. She thought there were new lines around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The cowboys were in high spirits, celebrating the successful drive with enthusiasm. Their voices grew louder as the beer flowed, and Emily caught fragments of conversation about cattle prices and spring calves. Normal talk, safe talk. Then Tom Pritchard had to open his mouth. "Well, if it isn't the hero himself," Tom announced, approaching Jace's group with his usual swagger. "Heard you've been playing rescuer again. Callahan, some men never learn." The saloon quieted. Jace set down his beer deliberately, turning to face Tom with dangerous calm. "You got something to say, Pritchard. Just wondering when you're going to see what everyone else sees." Tom's smile was mean. "That woman's trouble. Too tall, too strange, too desperate. She's using you, plain as day." "That's enough." Jace's voice was low, controlled. "Is it first woman who shows interest since your Sarah died? And you can't see straight. She probably planned the whole thing." Jace moved so fast Emily barely saw it. One moment, he was seated. The next, he had Tom pressed against the bar, forearm across his throat. "You say her name again," Jace said quietly. "You say either of their names again, and we'll settle this outside, permanent-like." Tom's face reddened, but he nodded frantically. Jace released him. Stepping back, the saloon held its collective breath. "Anyone else got opinions about Miss Donahue they'd like to share?" Jace addressed the room at large. "Or about my business no good? Then drink your beer and mind your own affairs." He threw coins on the bar and strode out, leaving silence in his wake. Emily stood frozen in the doorway to the kitchen, dish towel clutched in her hands. "Show's over," Red announced. "Next round's on the house, if everyone can remember their manners." The noise resumed gradually, but subdued now. Emily retreated to the kitchen, her mind churning. She'd become a source of conflict for Jace, bringing him the very scrutiny and gossip he'd worked so hard to avoid. The thought made her sick. An hour later, as she was preparing to return to the tack room, she found Jace waiting outside the saloon's back door. He stood in the shadows, hat pulled low. "I'm sorry," Emily said immediately. "About Tom, about all of it. I never meant to cause you trouble." "You didn't cause anything." His voice was rough. "Tom Pritchard's been looking for a fight since we were boys. This just gave him an excuse." "But the things he said were lies." Jay stepped closer, and Emily could see his face now in the lamplight from the kitchen. Every word. "You didn't plan anything. You didn't throw yourself in that creek, and you sure as hell aren't using me." "How can you be so sure?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Everyone else seems convinced." "Because I know you." He reached out, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. "I've watched you for weeks, seen how you work without complaint, how you treat everyone with dignity even when they don't deserve it, seen how you've made a home from nothing, turned that tack room into something warm and welcoming." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "You're the strongest woman I know. Emily Grace, you don't need to trap anyone. If anything, I'm the one who's caught." Emily's breath caught at the admission. Jace, I know we haven't. I know this isn't what you planned when you came here, but I need you to know that whatever people say, whatever lies they spread, I see you, the real you, and I'm not going anywhere. Tears pricked Emily's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness this time. I see you too, she whispered. And I think I'm caught too. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. But before either could say more, the saloon door banged open and one of his cowboys stuck his head out. Boss, that new hand's asking about the branding schedule. Want me to handle it? Jace sighed, stepping back. No, I'll talk to him. He looked at Emily. Can I walk you home first? It's 50 feet to the tack room, she pointed out, but she was smiling. Lot can happen in 50 feet. Creek taught us that. They walked slowly, neither wanting the moment to end. At her door, Jace paused. There's something else, he said. About what Tom said, about Sarah. He took a breath. I loved her. Part of me always will. But I've been using her memory as a wall, keeping everyone at arm's length. Then you came along and just walked right through it. Scared the hell out of me at first. And now I think maybe it's time to stop hiding behind ghosts. He touched her hand briefly. The past is gone, but you're here. That matters more than anything Tom Pritchard or anyone else has to say. After he left, Emily sat on her cot, replaying the conversation. Outside her window, she could see lights still burning in the saloon, hear the muffled voices of late-night drinkers. But for the first time since arriving in Dry Hollow, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She thought about the fury in Jace's eyes when he'd defended her, the gentleness in his touch, the vulnerability in his admission about Sarah. He'd laid himself bare tonight, trusting her with truths he'd kept hidden for years. The gossips could talk. Tom Pritchard could sneer. The proper ladies could clutch their pearls and predict disaster. But Emily had something none of them did, the trust of a good man who saw her truly, who'd chosen her not despite her height or her circumstances, but because of who she was beneath it all. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find little Maddie Greeley standing in the darkness, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, the child sobbed. I'm sorry my papa was mean to you. I heard him talking to Mrs. Pritchard, saying awful things, and I told him it was wrong, and he sent me to bed without supper, and I climbed out my window, and... Oh, sweetheart. Emily knelt, gathering the girl into her arms. Come inside. It's cold out here. She wrapped Maddie in a blanket and heated some milk on the stove, adding a precious spoonful of honey. As the child sipped, Emily noticed the careful darning on her nightgown, the too short hem. Does your papa know where you are? Maddie shook her head. He thinks I'm asleep. I'll go back soon. I promise. I wanted to say sorry, and to tell you that I think you're wonderful. I wish... She stopped, biting her lip. What do you wish? I wish you could have been my new mama, Maddie whispered. You're kind and tall and pretty, and you smiled at me. Papa picked wrong. Emily's heart broke a little. Your papa wants what he thinks is best for you. No, he wants what's best for him. The child's insight was startling. He wants someone who makes him feel tall. Emily couldn't argue with that. Well, I think you're pretty wonderful too, Miss Maddie, and very brave. Coming here tonight. Will you still be my friend, even though Papa says I can't talk to you? Always. Emily promised. Sometimes friendship just has to be quiet, that's all. After walking Maddie close enough to sneak back through her window, Emily returned to find Jace waiting by her door, concern creasing his brow. Saw you walking with someone small. Everything all right? Emily explained about Maddie's visit. Jace's expression darkened. Charles Greeley's a fool, he said flatly. That little girl deserves better. She does, Emily agreed. But then, don't we all? Jace studied her in the moonlight. Some of us are finding it, he said quietly. They stood there, the space between them humming with possibility. Then Jay stepped back, touching his hat. "Good night, Emily." "Good night, Jace." She watched him walk away, then closed her door and leaned against it, her heart full of too many emotions to name. Tomorrow would bring more gossip, more judgment, more small-minded cruelty. But it would also bring Jace at his usual table, that quiet smile when their eyes met, the promise of something building between them that no amount of whispered speculation could destroy. Let them talk, Emily thought fiercely. She'd found something real in this unlikely place, with this unexpected man, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone's narrow-minded opinions rob her of it. Outside, though she didn't know it, Jace stood watch as always. But tonight he wasn't guarding against dangers from without. Tonight he was guarding the new thing growing in his chest. Fragile as spring grass, but just as determined to push through the hard ground toward the sun. The morning after the confrontation with Tom Pritchard dawned cold and clear. Emily woke to find a folded piece of paper slipped under her door. Jace's handwriting was careful but unpracticed. "There's a room at the ranch, warm, dry, proper walls. If you want it, it's yours. No obligations, just shelter. Jay." Emily read the note 3 times, her heart racing. She knew what this meant in a small town like Dry Hollow. An unmarried woman living on an unmarried man's property, even in separate quarters, would set tongues wagging like nothing before. She dressed carefully and went to find Lorna, who was already at work in the kitchen, rolling out pie crusts with practiced efficiency. "He asked you to move out there, didn't he?" Lorna said without preamble. "Saw him writing that note last night after closing. How did you—" 20 years of marriage to Red has taught me to read men's faces. Jace had the look of a man making a big decision. Lorna dusted flour from her hands. "You going to accept—" "I don't know." Emily sank onto a stool. "People already talk. If I move to his ranch, people will talk regardless. Question is, do you want to spend another winter in that tack room? The cold's already creeping in at night, and it's only September." Emily thought about the growing chill, the way frost had kissed her window that morning. But more than that, she thought about the careful way Jace had written "no obligations," how he was offering shelter without demanding anything in return. "I need to see it first," she decided. Lorna smiled. "Smart girl. He'll be in for lunch. You can ride out with him after." But Jace didn't come for lunch. Instead, one of his ranch hands appeared with a message that he was dealing with a sick calf and would Emily mind riding out to see the place on her own. He'd drawn a simple map on the back of the note. Emily borrowed Lorna's gentle mare and followed the directions, winding through grassland that was turning golden with autumn. The Callahan Ranch sat in a valley protected by low hills, a modest but well-maintained operation. The main house was built of logs and stone, with a wide porch facing east. Smoke rose from the chimney. She dismounted near the barn, unsure whether to approach the house. The decision was made for her when Jace emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands dirty from work. "You came," he said simply. "You invited me." He wiped his hands on a rag, gesturing toward a smaller building set apart from the main house. "That's it. Used to be the foreman's quarters, back when the ranch was bigger." The building was indeed proper, with wooden walls, glass windows, and its own door painted green. Inside, Emily found a single room, but spacious and well-appointed. A bed with an iron frame sat against one wall, a wardrobe against another. There was a table and 2 chairs, a bookshelf, even a small rug on the plank floor. Everything was clean, but had the musty smell of disuse. "It's been empty 2 years," Jace explained from the doorway, not entering. "Needs airing out, maybe some new curtains. The stove works well, I checked this morning." Emily ran her hand along the table's smooth surface. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve better than a tack room. Because winter's coming and that roof won't hold snow." He paused. "Because I can't stand the thought of you cold and alone when there's perfectly good shelter here going to waste." People will assume. Let them assume. His voice carried an edge of frustration. I'm tired of living my life according to what others might think. Aren't you? Emily turned to face him fully. He filled the doorway, solid and real, his eyes holding that intensity she'd come to recognize. What do you want from me? Jace. Nothing you don't want to give. He stepped back, giving her space. I'm not Charles Greeley, Emily. I'm not looking for a woman to fit some idea in my head. I just want you to be warm and safe. The rest we can figure out as we go. And if I say yes, if I move here, then you move here. You'll have your own space. Come and go as you please. I'll be in the main house. Close enough if you need anything. Far enough for propriety. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, or at least as much propriety as we can manage. Emily walked to the window. She could see the main house from here, could imagine the peace of this valley, away from the constant scrutiny of town. I'll need to think about it. Of course. He moved to leave, then paused. There's something else. Come see. He led her around the building to a small lean-to addition she hadn't noticed. Inside was set up as a simple workshop, with good light from a window. Thought you might want space for your sewing, he said. Lorna mentioned you've been taking in mending. The thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed her. He'd considered not just her basic needs, but her work, her independence. Jace. Don't answer now, he said quickly. Think it over. The room's here whether you want it or not. They rode back to town together, mostly in silence. But it was a comfortable quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they neared Dry Hollow, Emily became aware of people watching from windows and doorways. By evening, everyone would know she'd ridden out to the Callahan Ranch. That night, Emily sat in the tack room, trying to imagine winter here. Already she could feel drafts through the walls, and Lorna was right, the roof would never hold snow. Pride warred with practicality, fear with longing. Near midnight, rain began to fall. Not the gentle patter of spring, but the hard, cold rain that preceded winter. Emily pulled her blanket tighter, listening to the drops find every weak spot in the roof. 3 separate leaks had started, and she positioned every container she owned to catch them. A knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find Jace, water streaming from his hat and coat. This is foolish, he said without preamble. You're sitting here getting rained on because of what people might say. I'm standing out here in a storm because of what people might think. We're both grown people making ourselves miserable for the sake of gossip. Jace. I'm not asking you to share my bed. Emily, I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself. I'm just asking you to come in out of the rain. His voice dropped. Please. Emily looked around the leaking room, at her few possessions getting damp despite her efforts. She thought about pride and propriety, and the opinion of people who'd judged her from the moment she'd arrived. Then she thought about the warm, dry room waiting in the valley, the man standing in the rain because he cared about her comfort more than his own. All right, she said quietly. I'll come. Relief washed over his face. Now. She began gathering her things. Before I lose my nerve. They loaded her possessions onto his wagon, everything she owned fitting too easily in the bed. The ride to the ranch was wet and cold, but Emily hardly noticed. She was too aware of the bridge she was crossing, the decision she'd made. Jace carried her things into the room while she lit the stove. Soon, warmth was spreading through the space, chasing away the mustiness. He'd thought of everything there was: wood stacked by the stove, water in a pitcher, even a basket of food on the table. Thank you, Emily said as he prepared to leave. He paused at the door. There's coffee on my stove in the mornings. You're welcome to it. Welcome to anything you need. After he left, Emily stood in the middle of her new room, her dry, warm, solid room. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the main house as she watched. Jace's silhouette passed by a window, and she realized he was checking on her, making sure she could see his light. She unpacked slowly, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe, arranging her few books on the shelf. Her mother's Bible went on the bedside table. When everything was in place, she sat on the bed, a real bed with a proper mattress, and let the reality sink in. Tomorrow, Dry Hollow would erupt with scandal. The tall spinster had moved in with Jace Callahan. The story would be twisted, embellished, turned into something sordid. But sitting in her warm, dry room, listening to rain that couldn't touch her, Emily found she didn't care. For the first time since leaving Kansas, she felt like she might actually have a home. Not just a shelter, but a place where she was wanted, where someone had prepared for her coming, thought about her needs, offered without demanding. She changed into her nightgown and lay down on the bed, luxuriating in its comfort. Through the window, she could still see the light burning in Jace's house, standing guard, as always, but from a respectful distance now. No obligations. He'd written, but Emily felt the weight of something else entirely, not obligation, but possibility. The chance for something real to grow between them, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. She thought about his words in the rain. We're both grown people making ourselves miserable for the sake of gossip. He was right. They'd been letting others dictate their choices, letting fear of judgment keep them from simple human kindness and connection. No more, Emily decided. She'd taken his offer of shelter, and tomorrow she'd face whatever consequences came. But tonight, she was warm and dry and safe, with a good man's light burning steady in the darkness. It was enough, more than enough. It was a beginning. The news traveled faster than wildfire. By the time Emily rode into town the next morning for her shift at the saloon, it seemed every soul in Dry Hollow knew she'd moved to the Callahan Ranch. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she passed. Women pulled their children closer. Men exchanged knowing looks and crude gestures they thought she couldn't see. At the Mercantile, where she stopped for thread, Mrs. Pritchard made a show of moving her displayed goods away from Emily's reach, as if impropriety might be contagious. I suppose you think you've won. Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice dripping acid. Compromising that poor man, forcing his hand. Emily kept her voice steady. I've forced nothing, Mrs. Pritchard. Mr. Callahan offered shelter. I accepted. It's as simple as that. Simple, the woman laughed harshly. Nothing about this situation is simple. You've ruined yourself, girl, and him in the bargain. Emily paid for her thread and left without another word. But her hands shook as she walked to the saloon. She'd expected judgment, but the venom still stung. The saloon was worse. The lunch crowd was larger than usual. Men who normally ate at home crowding in to get a look at the fallen woman. Their eyes followed her every move. Conversations peppered with barely veiled innuendo. Bet Callahan's happy with his new arrangement, someone snickered. Must be nice, having that tall drink of water warming his... That's enough. Red's voice boomed across the room. Any man who can't keep a civil tongue can find somewhere else to drink. But the damage was accumulating. Emily spilled soup, dropped plates, her usual grace deserting her under the weight of so many hostile stares. When she retreated to the kitchen, she found Lorna waiting with a cup of tea and a sympathetic expression. It'll pass, Lorna said gently. New scandal always does. Will it? Emily sank onto a stool. Or will I always be the woman who what accepted shelter from a decent man who chose warmth over pride? Lorna's eyes flashed. You've done nothing wrong. Emily Grace, nothing. But it didn't feel that way when Emily emerged to find Charles Greeley holding court near the bar. Maddie nowhere in sight. Should have known she was that type of woman when she showed up here alone. Charles was saying, no decent female travels without family or husband. I saw right through her from the start. That why you tried to marry her? Someone called out. Earning laughs. Charles's face reddened. I was prepared to give her respectability, a proper home, a place in society. Instead, she chose to become Callahan's... Finish that sentence and you'll regret it. Everyone turned. Jay stood in the doorway, still dusty from the range, his expression carved from stone. The room fell silent as he walked slowly to where Charles stood. "You rejected Miss Donahue because she was too tall," Jace said, his voice carrying clearly. "Sent her into the street with nowhere to go. Now you stand here claiming moral superiority." He stepped closer to the smaller man. "You're a hypocrite and a coward, Greeley. And if you say one more word about Emily, I'll forget you've got a child who needs a father." Charles backed away, but his mouth kept moving. "She's living in your house. Everyone knows what that means. She's living in the foreman's cottage, a separate building entirely, with her own door, her own key, paying rent from her wages." Jace's voice dropped dangerously. "But even if she wasn't, even if she was in my house, in my bed, that would be between her and me, and none of your damn business." Gasps echoed through the room. Such frank talk was shocking even in a saloon. "You can't threaten me," Charles blustered. "I'll have the law." "The law?" Jace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For what's speaking truth, get out, Greeley, and take your poison tongue with you." Charles fled, and slowly the normal noise of the saloon resumed. Jace walked to the bar, taking his usual seat as if nothing had happened. But when Emily brought his beer, she saw the tension in his jaw, the white knuckles as he gripped the glass. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This is what I was afraid of. You shouldn't have to defend—" "Stop!" He looked up at her. "I knew what would happen when I made the offer. I chose this. Emily. We both did." "But your reputation—" "My reputation," he smiled grimly. "I'm the man who buried his fiancée and turned into a hermit. Adding defender of fallen women to the list hardly matters." "I'm not fallen," Emily said firmly. "I know that. You know that. But this town—" He shook his head. "This town loves its stories. Question is, do we let their stories define us?" That evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she found a small crowd gathered outside the saloon. Her heart sank, expecting more confrontation, but instead of hostility, she saw curiosity and something that might have been respect. "Miss Donahue," a woman stepped forward. "Mrs. Henderson, whom Emily had delivered fabric to weeks ago. I wanted to say what Jace Callahan did in there. Standing up to Charles Greeley, that took courage. Both of you have courage." Others nodded, and Emily realized not everyone in Dry Hollow was against them. There were quiet supporters, people who understood that life was more complicated than gossip allowed. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Jace had waited to escort her, another gesture that would fuel tomorrow's talk. As they reached the valley, Emily made a decision. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about why I really came west." Jace slowed his horse, giving her his full attention. "My mother died last year. Consumption. I nursed her for 2 years, watched her fade away by degrees. After she was gone, I had nothing, no family, no prospects, no future. I wasn't even looking for love when I answered Charles's advertisement. I just wanted to belong somewhere, to matter to someone." "You matter," Jace said softly. "Do I, or am I just another obligation, another person you feel compelled to protect?" Jace dismounted, coming to help her down. His hands lingered on her waist as he set her on the ground. "You're not an obligation. Emily, you're—" He struggled for words. "You're the first person in 3 years who's made me want to be more than a ghost, made me want to live instead of just exist. The town thinks we're already—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know what they think." His hands were still on her waist, warm through the fabric of her dress. "Maybe that gives us freedom. They've already judged us. We might as well live however we choose." "And how do you choose?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Instead of answering, Jace pulled an envelope from his pocket. "This came today, from Oregon. My sister lives there with her husband. She's been asking me to visit, to consider relocating, starting fresh where nobody knows our history." Emily's heart dropped. You're leaving. That's what I need to decide. He released her, stepping back. And you need to decide too, whether you want to keep fighting this town's prejudice, or come with me, if I go. He met her eyes. I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But I'm tired of letting the past or other people's opinions dictate my life. Sarah's gone. Your mother's gone. We're here. Isn't that enough? Emily couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Jace touched her cheek gently, then walked to his house, leaving her standing in the twilight between their two dwellings. Inside her cottage, Emily lit the lamp and sat at the table, staring at nothing. Oregon, a place where she wouldn't be the too-tall spinster who'd moved in with a man, where Jace wouldn't be the grieving rancher who'd taken in a desperate woman. They could be anyone. They could be themselves. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Jace holding a dinner tray. You didn't eat, he said simply. Too much drama, not enough food. She stepped aside to let him in. He set the tray on the table stew, biscuits, even a slice of pie. They sat across from each other, and Emily found herself hungry despite everything. Tell me about Oregon, she said. As they ate, Jace talked about his sister's letters, the green valleys, the opportunities for ranching, the growing towns that welcomed newcomers. His voice grew animated, and Emily saw a glimpse of who he might have been before grief settled over him like dust. It sounds wonderful, she said when he finished. It could be. He reached across the table, taking her hand. Emily, I need you to know if you come with me. It wouldn't be as my kept woman or my employee or my obligation. It would be as... He paused, choosing his words carefully. As whatever you want it to be, my friend, my partner. Maybe someday, if you wanted more. Emily turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. And if I wanted more now? His breath caught. Then we'd have that conversation, but not tonight. Tonight you're tired and overwhelmed and hurt by ugly words. Any decision between us should be made in sunlight, not shadows. It was the respect in his voice that undid her. After weeks of assumptions and crude insinuations, here was a man who valued her choices, who understood that desire and decisions shouldn't be made from desperation. Stay, she said softly. Just for a while. Not for that. Just stay. He squeezed her hand. All right. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the table. As night deepened outside, tomorrow would bring more gossip, more judgment, but it would also bring the possibility of Oregon, of a future neither of them had imagined when Emily stepped off that wagon in Dry Hollow. For now, this was enough. The warm room, the empty plates pushed aside, their hands joined in the lamplight. Two people who'd lost everything finding something new in each other. Despite the odds, despite the talk, despite their own fears. When Jace finally rose to leave, Emily walked him to the door. On impulse, she raised up on her toes and kissed his cheek, feeling his sharp intake of breath. Thank you, she said, for defending me, for dinner, for Oregon, for everything. He touched the spot where her lips had been, wonder in his eyes. Emily. Sunlight, she reminded him softly. Decisions in sunlight. He nodded and left, and Emily watched until his door closed behind him. Then she prepared for bed, her mind full of possibilities that had nothing to do with Dry Hollow's narrow minds, and everything to do with the broad horizon waiting somewhere beyond these hills. October arrived with a vengeance. The first real storm of the season rolled down from the mountains on a Tuesday evening, bringing snow that fell thick and fast. Emily had just finished her shift at the saloon when the sky opened up, transforming the familiar road to the ranch into a white wilderness. You can't ride in this, Lorna said firmly, peering out at the swirling snow. Stay here tonight. The tack room's still empty. But Emily thought of Jace, alone at the ranch. probably wondering why she hadn't returned. They'd developed a rhythm over the past 2 weeks, careful, respectful, but warming like embers tended patiently. She'd catch him watching her with something soft in his eyes, and he'd find small excuses to brush her hand when passing tools or dishes. "I need to get back," Emily said. "He'll worry." Red shook his head. "Trail's already drifting. You'd be lost before you cleared town." As if to emphasize his point, the wind howled harder, rattling the windows. Emily reluctantly accepted defeat, but insisted on trying to send word to Jace. One of the ranch hands who lived in town promised to try reaching the Callahan place if the storm let up. It didn't let up. For 2 days, Dry Hollow found itself buried under snow that fell relentlessly. Emily helped Lorna and Red keep the saloon running, serving hot soup and coffee to anyone who struggled through the drifts. The enforced confinement meant close quarters with people who'd been avoiding her. But crisis has a way of rearranging priorities. "My Johnny's fever won't break, Mrs." Muller confided, accepting the soup Emily offered. 2 weeks ago, she'd crossed the street to avoid her. "Doc Hanson can't get through from Clear Ridge." "Willow bark tea," Emily suggested. "And cool cloths." My mother swore by it. "Mrs." Muller's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you. I'm sorry for how I've been. You're a good woman, Miss Donahue." By the 3rd day, the storm had passed but left behind chest-high drifts and bitter cold. Emily was serving breakfast when the saloon door burst open. Jay stood there, covered in snow, his face raw from wind and cold. "Emily," relief colored his voice as his eyes found her. "Thank God." She dropped the coffee pot, barely registering as it shattered on the floor. "Jace, how did you—" "Walked, mostly." Horse gave out a mile back. He swayed on his feet, and Emily rushed to steady him. His clothes were frozen stiff, ice in his beard. "You walked 5 miles through this." Lorna appeared with blankets. "Have you lost your mind?" "Had to know she was safe," Jace mumbled, his words slightly slurred from cold. "Kept thinking about her trying to ride back, getting lost." They got him to a chair by the stove, Emily working to remove his frozen boots while Lorna heated coffee and Red fetched dry clothes from somewhere. Jace's hands were dangerously pale, and Emily chafed them between her own, trying to restore circulation. "Foolish man," she murmured, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Wonderful, foolish man." "Couldn't stop thinking," his teeth chattered. "What if something happened and I never told you?" "Told me what?" But he was too cold to continue, focusing on getting warm. It took an hour before color returned to his extremities, before his shivering subsided enough for coherent speech. The lunch crowd had gathered, but for once their attention felt more respectful than prurient. A man who'd risk freezing to death for a woman's safety earned a certain regard, even from gossips. "Are you planning to try walking back?" Red asked. Jace looked out at the snow-choked street. "Soon as I can feel my feet." "Don't be daft," Lorna said. "You'll stay here tonight, both of you. The storm's supposed to circle back, and I won't have either of you dying for stubbornness." They were given a small room upstairs, usually reserved for travelers. 2 narrow beds with a respectable distance between them. Emily helped Jace up the stairs, his body still stiff from cold and exertion. "You didn't have to come," she said as he sank onto one of the beds. "I was safe." "I didn't know that." He caught her hand as she turned away. "Emily, when that storm hit and you didn't come home," he stopped, correcting himself. Didn't come back. I kept thinking about all the things I haven't said, haven't done, because I was waiting for the right moment." Emily sat on the other bed, facing him. "And what things are those?" "That I love you." The words came out simple, unadorned. Not the idea of you, not the convenience of you, the way you hum when you're sewing, how you stand taller when someone tries to make you feel small, the kindness you show even to people who don't deserve it. Emily's vision blurred. "Jace!" "I know we said sunlight," decisions in sunlight. But I nearly froze to death today because I couldn't stand not knowing if you were safe. I think that earns me some honesty in lamplight." She moved to sit beside him, taking his still cold hands in hers. "You want honesty? I love you too. Have for weeks. Maybe from that first night you stood in the rain, but I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of wanting this too much. Of building a life with you only to lose it. Of not being enough. Being too much, too tall, too strange, too—" He silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. "You're exactly right. Everything about you. And I'm scared too. Scared of losing again, of not being the man you deserve. But I think maybe being scared together is better than being safe alone." Downstairs, they could hear the evening crowd gathering, voices rising with drink and warmth. Up here, in their small room, the world felt distant and muffled by snow. "Oregon," Emily said softly. "You really want to go?" "I want a fresh start. Somewhere we can be ourselves without the weight of everyone's assumptions." He shifted to face her fully. "My sister wrote again. Her husband knows people. Could help us get established. I could run cattle there. You could have a real sewing shop, not just mending in a borrowed room." "Us," Emily repeated. "You keep saying us. Is that presumptuous, should I?" This time she silenced him, but with her lips on his, the kiss was gentle, tentative, both of them learning the shape of this new thing between them. When they parted, Jace's eyes were bright with wonder. "That's a yes to us?" he asked. "That's a yes to us, to Oregon, to whatever comes next." She touched his face, feeling the warmth returning to his skin. "But there's something else we need to discuss. Something you said downstairs about my not coming home." Color rose in his cheeks. "I misspoke." "Did you?" Emily's heart hammered, but she pressed on. "Because that little house has felt more like home than anywhere since my mother died. Not just the house, the whole ranch. The mornings when you accidentally make too much coffee. The evenings when we find excuses to linger over dinner." "Emily, what are you saying?" She took a breath, gathering courage. "I'm saying that when we go to Oregon, I want to go as your wife. If that's something you want too." The silence stretched between them, and Emily began to fear she'd misread everything. Then Jace pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Want it?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I've dreamed of it, but I didn't want to pressure you. Didn't want you to feel obligated because of living arrangements or town gossip or—" "Stop!" She pulled back to look at him. "I'm not a child. Jace Callahan. I know my own mind. I choose you. Not because I need shelter or protection or respectability. Because I love you. Because you see me as I am and somehow find me worthy of walking 5 miles through a blizzard." 6 miles, he corrected with a small smile. "And I'd do it again." They held each other as wind rattled the windows. Snow beginning to fall again. Tomorrow would bring complications, plans to make, a wedding to arrange, a journey to prepare for. There would be those in Dry Hollow who'd say she'd trapped him, others who'd claim he'd compromised her. Let them talk. "We should tell Lorna and Red," Emily said eventually. "They've been good to us." "In the morning," Jace murmured, his arms tightening around her. "For now, just let me hold you. Let me believe this is real." Emily settled against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her cheek. Outside, the storm raged renewed, but inside their small room, there was only warmth and the quiet certainty of 2 people who'd found each other against all odds. "It's real," she whispered. "We're real." They stayed like that, fully clothed and perfectly proper by any standard except the most rigid. 2 narrow beds in a respectable boarding house room, but only one occupied as they held each other through the storm. Not from passion that would come later, in its own time, but from a need to affirm their connection, to make up for all the nights they'd spent apart when their hearts were already joined. When dawn broke clear and crystalline over a world transformed by snow, they were still entwined, having dozed fitfully but never letting go. the first sunlight of a new day. Emily thought with sleepy amusement, perfect for the decisions they'd already made in the honesty of darkness and storm. Downstairs, Lorna took one look at their joined hands and linked arms and smiled. "About time," was all she said, then busied herself making a breakfast feast. The news would spread. Emily knew, by noon. Everyone would know that Jace Callahan and the tall woman from Kansas were planning to marry and leave for Oregon. Some would rejoice in being rid of them. Others might quietly wish them well. But sitting in the warm kitchen, Jace's thumb tracing circles on her hand, snow sparkling like diamonds outside the window, Emily found she truly didn't care what anyone thought. She'd found her home, not in a place, but in a person. Everything else was just geography. Spring came early that year, melting the snow from the mountain passes by late March. Emily stood in the doorway of what had been her cottage for 6 months, watching Jace load the last of their belongings onto the wagon. They'd been married for 3 weeks now, wed in a simple ceremony at the church with Red and Lorna as witnesses and half the town watching from a careful distance. "That's everything," Jace said, securing the canvas cover. "You ready?" Emily took one last look around the valley that had become home, the main house where they'd spent their first weeks as husband and wife, the cottage where she'd learned to hope again, the distant hills where they'd ridden together, planning their future. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The journey to town for final goodbyes proved more emotional than expected. Word of their departure had spread, and people Emily hadn't expected lined the street. Mrs. Muller pressed a quilt into her hands. "For cold Oregon nights," she said, tears in her eyes. "And thank you, my Johnny's healthy because of your advice." Mrs. Henderson hobbled out with a basket of preserves. Even Tom Pritchard nodded grudgingly as they passed, though he kept his usual comments to himself. At the saloon, Lorna had prepared a farewell feast. The lunch crowd was bigger than usual, filled with faces that had become familiar over the months. Some had been kind from the start, others had warmed slowly, and a few remained distant, but they'd all come to see them off. "You take care of each other," Lorna said, embracing Emily fiercely. "And I want to hear everything about Oregon." Red shook Jace's hand, then pulled him into a rough hug. "You're a good man, Callahan. Always knew it. Glad you finally figured it out, too." As they prepared to leave, Emily noticed a small figure hovering near the door. Maddie Greeley stood there, her father nowhere in sight, clutching something in her hands. "Maddie," Emily knelt to the child's level. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "I snuck out," Maddie whispered, glancing around nervously. "I wanted to give you this." She thrust forward a small embroidered handkerchief. Crooked stitches spelling out EGC, Emily Grace Callahan. "I made it myself, so you won't forget me." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she pulled the girl into a hug. "I could never forget you. You were my first friend here." "Papa says you're a bad woman," Maddie said into Emily's shoulder. "But I think he's wrong. I think you're brave." "We both are," Emily said, pulling back to look at the child's face. "And someday, you will be too. Remember that. No matter what anyone says, you get to choose who you become." Charles Greeley appeared in the doorway, his face thunderous. "Maddie, get away from her!" The little girl squeezed Emily's hand once more, then scurried to her father. Charles grabbed her arm roughly, and Emily started to rise, protective instincts flaring. "Greeley," Jace's voice was quiet but carried warning. "Handle her gently." Charles glared but loosened his grip. As he turned to go, he looked back at Emily. "You've filled her head with foolish ideas." "I've told her she matters." Emily replied steadily. "If that's foolish, then I'm glad to be a fool." After they left, Emily tucked Maddie's handkerchief carefully into her pocket, next to the one Jace had given her so long ago. Circles closing, she thought, stories ending and beginning. The wagon rolled out of Dry Hollow as the sun reached its peak. Emily sat beside Jace on the bench seat, her hand resting on his knee. Neither looked back. They'd said their goodbyes, made their peace. The future lay ahead, somewhere beyond the mountains. They made camp that first night by a stream, the spring air soft and full of promise. As Emily prepared their simple meal over the campfire, Jace spread blankets in the wagon bed, creating a cozy nest under the stars. "No more sleeping apart," he said, catching her watching. "No more careful distances." Emily smiled, remembering all those nights in the cottage. Him in the main house. Propriety maintained even after their wedding for the sake of completing business in town. No more standing in the rain, wondering. After dinner, they lay together in their makeshift bed. Emily's head on Jace's shoulder, watching stars appear one by one. The night was warm enough that they needed only one blanket, which Jace tucked carefully around them both. "Are you afraid?" Emily asked. "Leaving everything behind?" "I left everything behind 3 years ago when Sarah died," Jace said quietly. "This isn't leaving, this is finally moving forward." Emily rose up on one elbow to look at him. In the moonlight, his face was both familiar and new. The man she'd married still revealing himself in layers. "Do you think she would have approved of me? Of this?" Jace considered carefully, one hand coming up to trace Emily's cheek. "Sarah loved life, loved laughter and adventures and new beginnings. She would have wanted me to find happiness again." He paused. "She would have liked you. Your strength, your kindness. The way you stand tall even when the world tries to make you small." "I don't feel strong," Emily admitted. "Half the time I feel like I'm pretending to be braver than I am." "Maybe that's what courage is," Jace suggested. "Being scared but doing it anyway." They were quiet for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through new leaves. Then Jace shifted, turning to face her fully. "Emily," he said, and something in his voice made her heart race. "We've been married 3 weeks, but we've been careful, cautious, waiting for the right moment, the right place. But lying here under these stars, starting our new life, I don't want to wait anymore." Emily's breath caught. They'd shared a bed since their wedding night, but always fully clothed, always careful not to presume, both carrying their own fears and past hurts, neither wanting to rush what felt too precious to risk. "I don't want to wait either," she whispered. "But I've never—" "I know," Jace said gently. "Neither have I. Not like this. Not with someone I love the way I love you." The admission hung between them that even his relationship with Sarah, for all its sweetness, hadn't contained this depth of connection born from struggle and choice and 2 broken people choosing to heal together. "Then we'll learn together," Emily said, and kissed him. What followed was tender and fumbling and perfect in its imperfection. 2 people who'd guarded their hearts so carefully, finally letting the walls fall completely under the vast Oregon sky, in a wagon bed made soft with quilts and hope. Emily discovered what it meant to be truly seen, truly held, truly loved. Afterward, they lay entwined. Emily's hair spread across Jace's chest like auburn silk. He traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady, and hers. Was I? Emily started, suddenly shy. Jace tilted her chin up, kissing her softly. "You were perfect. We were perfect. This is perfect." "Even though I'm too tall," she teased, echoing the words that had started everything. "Especially because you're tall," he said firmly. "Means I don't have to bend down so far to kiss you." He demonstrated, and Emily laughed against his lips, happiness bubbling up like a spring. 6 months ago, she'd stood in a dusty street, rejected and alone. Now she lay in her husband's arms, heading toward a future neither of them could have imagined. "I love you, Jace Callahan," she said. "And I love you, Emily Grace Callahan," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after." They fell asleep like that, wound around each other, the wagon rocking gently in the night breeze. When dawn broke pink and gold over the mountains, they woke slowly, savoring the warmth of each other before the day's journey. It would take weeks to reach Oregon. There would be rivers to cross, mountains to climb, challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But as Emily made coffee over the morning fire, humming softly while Jace readied the horses, she felt no fear. They'd already crossed the hardest distance, the space between two guarded hearts. Everything else was just miles to be traveled together. As the wagon rolled on, carrying them toward their new life, Emily fingered the 2 handkerchiefs in her pocket, one from the man who'd stood still as she cried, who'd reached for her when she needed saving, one from a little girl who'd seen her truly. She thought about Charles Greeley, probably in his store right now, still searching for a woman to fit his narrow vision, about Tom Pritchard and his mean spirit, about all the people who'd tried to make her smaller, lesser, wrong. But mostly she thought about Lorna and Red's kindness, about Mrs. Muller's gratitude, about Mrs. Henderson's quiet support, about all the ways love could grow even in hard soil, if you were patient enough to tend it. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jace asked, glancing over with that soft smile that still made her heart flutter. "Just thinking about how glad I am that Charles Greeley found me too tall," Emily said. Jace laughed, rich and full. "Remind me to thank him if we ever pass through Dry Hollow again." "Let's not," Emily said, leaning against his shoulder. "Let's only go forward." "Forward it is," Jace agreed, and snapped the reins gently, urging the horses on toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. Behind them, their tracks in the dust were already fading. Ahead, the whole world spread out like a promise, wide and wild and theirs for the taking. And Emily Grace Callahan, who'd once thought herself too tall for love, sat straight and proud beside her husband. Finally, the perfect height for the life she'd chosen. The wagon rolled on, carrying 2 hearts that had found home in each other, toward a spring that would last forever in their souls. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and new beginnings in the Old West. I hope Emily and Jace's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and let me know what country or state you're in. It's amazing how these stories can connect people from all around the world. Share your thoughts about Emily and Jace's story. Did you have a favorite moment? If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 for more authentic frontier romances and adventures. Don't forget to like this video and hit that hype button to help more people discover these heartwarming stories from America's past. Your support means the world and helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.